On March 15, 1986, Evan Maxford walked into a Toys R Us at the Fairfax Circle shopping center in Fairfax, Virginia, and purchased something that would expose one of the most creative espionage operations of the Cold War. He bought an Atari 2600 Junior, the newly redesigned version of America's most popular video game console, a compact black unit with a rainbow stripe that retailed for $49.99. Evan was a 42-year-old electronics technician who worked for a defense contractor, and his youngest son, Max, had been begging for an Atari. What Maxford couldn't have known was that an Atari game cartridge would set into motion an FBI investigation and reveal a smuggling network operating in plain sight. The Atari 2600 Junior was a last-ditch effort by Atari Corporation to revive a console that many considered obsolete. Nintendo had already begun its conquest with the entertainment system, and most analysts viewed the 2600 as a relic from a bygone era. The Junior was smaller, cost-reduced in every way that mattered to a manufacturer, and backward-compatible with games released since 1977. For families who couldn't afford a Nintendo, the Junior was an entry point into gaming, a chance to play Pac-Man, Space Invaders, or Missile Command without breaking the family budget. Maxford drove to his home in Kings Park West and helped his son Max hook up his new console to the television in the family room. The system came packaged without any games, part of Atari's cost-cutting strategy to keep the retail price competitive. So Maxford had also picked up a bargain bin copy of Junior Pac-Man for $7. Max was thrilled when the title screen finally appeared, that familiar yellow character, rendered in blocky pixels, that somehow still managed to convey personality and charm, despite the technical limitations. The graphics were primitive by any measure. Simple geometric shapes in bright primary colors moving across black backgrounds. But there was something immediate and accessible about the experience that more sophisticated systems couldn't quite replicate. Max guided the yellow character through mazes, eating dots with that distinctive waka waka sound effect, running from ghosts that were barely more than colored squares with eyes. The game had no pause function, no save states, no continues. When you died, you started over, and that simplicity created its own form of tension and engagement. Maxford watched for a while, remembering his own childhood in the 50s, when entertainment had been vastly different, when television itself was still a novelty and video games were pure science fiction. Now, here was his son, manipulating images on a screen with nothing more than a plastic joystick and a single red button, completely absorbed in a digital world that existed only in phosphor dots and silicon chips. Max played Junior Pac-Man for hours that first day, mastering the timing of the ghost patterns, learning which power pellets to grab and when, celebrating each new high score with genuine excitement. Maxford watched the numbers tick upward on the screen, hearing the repetitive bleeps and bloops of the sound chip, and then retreated to his garage workshop to tinker with a radio receiver he'd been repairing, leaving his son to explore this digital frontier alone. 3 weeks passed without incident. Max played Junior Pac-Man until he'd exhausted every maze variation, which didn't take long given the game's repetitive nature. He wanted more cartridges, but games cost between $15 and $30 each, and Maxford wasn't about to invest that kind of money for a system that was already outdated. So when his wife Janice mentioned seeing a garage sale sign on Gainsborough Drive, Maxford suggested they stop by. Garage sales were common in their neighborhood. Families clearing out attics and basements, selling off belongings they no longer needed. Janice was hoping for kitchen items, maybe some dishes or glassware. Maxford thought there might be tools. What they found among the usual assortment of clothing, books, and household goods was a cardboard box containing 8 Atari 2600 game cartridges. The woman running the sale, Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an elderly widow who looked to be in her 70s, said the games had belonged to her grandson. He'd left them behind when he moved out the previous summer, and she had no use for them. She was asking $2 per cartridge, or $10 for the entire box. Maxford examined the titles: River Raid, Pitfall, Asteroids, Missile Command, Demon Attack, Megamania, Barnstorming, and one he didn't recognize, a cartridge with a plain white label that simply said Space Battle 2. Maxford handed Mrs. Vasquez a $10 bill. Janice gave him a look, but Max was already tearing into the box, pulling out River Raid and asking if they could leave immediately so he could try it. They drove home, and Max spent the rest of Saturday afternoon playing through the collection, working his way from one game to the next, with the enthusiasm only a 12-year-old could muster. All of the games worked perfectly, except for the one with the white label. When Max inserted Space Battle 2 and turned on the console, the screen remained black. No graphics, no sound, nothing. He tried pressing the reset button, toggling the difficulty switches, even blowing into the cartridge connector, a ritual that every Atari owner knew by heart, but the game refused to load. He brought the defective cartridge to his father's workshop. Maxford took it, turned it over, and noticed immediately it felt different. Slightly heavier, the plastic case, not quite the same texture. He told Max he'd look at it when he had time. Maxford didn't examine the cartridge until Tuesday night, April 8th. He'd worked late, but something about the defective game nagged at him. He was the kind of man who couldn't leave a broken thing unexamined. He sat at his workbench, turned on his bright halogen lamp, and studied the cartridge. The case was held together by 4 Phillips head screws, unusual for Atari cartridges. Most were held together by tabs or screws hidden under the label. Maxford removed the screws and pried the case apart. Inside was a printed circuit board unlike any he'd seen. A standard Atari 2600 cartridge contained a single ROM chip with minimal support circuitry. This board had 3 integrated circuits. The ROM chip was there, a 24-pin package that looked standard in form factor, but accompanied by 2 additional chips with markings he couldn't identify. The traces were unusually complex, suggesting data processing beyond what was necessary for game code. Maxford sat back, frowning. He'd worked with electronics for 20 years, first in the Air Force as a radar technician, then in the private sector for a defense contractor. He knew what standard consumer electronics looked like, and this wasn't it. The circuitry reminded him of military hardware, encryption devices where data needed to be encoded or stored in non-standard formats. He spent an hour examining the board under magnification, taking notes. The chips bore non-standard markings. One had a faint code reading 8417. His first thought was bootleg, but the more he looked, the less sense that made. A bootleg would use the cheapest components available. This board was over-engineered, with chips that appeared custom-manufactured. Maxford reassembled the cartridge carefully and sat for a long time at his workbench, thinking. He worked for a defense contractor, a company that specialized in secure communication systems for the Department of Defense and various intelligence agencies. His security clearance was active, renewed just 6 months earlier after the usual background check and polygraph examination. He knew the protocols for reporting suspicious activity, the channels that existed for raising concerns about potential security breaches or unusual encounters with foreign nationals. But he also knew how seriously those channels were taken, how a false alarm could damage a career, create unnecessary scrutiny. He was hesitant to create a panic over what might turn out to be nothing more than a hobbyist's unusual project or a peculiar piece of electronics history. This was 1986. The Cold War was still very much alive, and tensions between the superpowers remained high despite recent summit meetings and talk of arms control. The previous year had seen numerous espionage cases make headlines, arrests of Americans who'd sold secrets to Moscow, revelations about spy networks that had operated undetected for years. The intelligence community was on edge, hyper-vigilant about potential security breaches. He decided to bring the cartridge to work the following day and show it to Carl Hutchison, a senior engineer in the hardware development lab. Carl had a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT and had worked on classified projects for the NSA before joining the company in 1979. If anyone could identify what these chips were and what function they served, it would be Carl. Carl had seen everything in his 30-year career, from early transistor designs to modern integrated circuits, and he had the kind of experience and institutional knowledge that made him the go-to person for anything unusual or difficult to identify. Wednesday morning, April 9th. Maxford arrived at his office in Tyson's Corner 20 minutes early and went straight to Carl Hutchison's lab on the 3rd floor. Carl was already there, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup and reviewing schematics spread across a light table, his thick glasses reflecting the bright fluorescent illumination. He was 56 years old, balding, with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who cared more about his work than his wardrobe. When Maxford knocked on the door frame, Carl looked up and waved him in. Maxford explained the situation, keeping his voice neutral, trying not to sound alarmist. He described buying the cartridge at a garage sale, discovering it didn't work when his son tried to play it, opening it up out of curiosity and finding circuitry that didn't match anything he'd seen in consumer electronics during his 2 decades working with electronic systems. He placed the disassembled cartridge on Carl's workbench and stepped back, giving the older engineer room to examine it. Carl put down his coffee cup and picked up the PCB, holding it close to his face. He was quiet for several minutes, examining the chips closely, tracing the circuit pathways with his finger, occasionally making small sounds of interest or concern. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to Maxford, Carl set the board down carefully and looked up. The chips were Soviet-made, Carl said with certainty. The design style, the materials used in the substrate, all pointed to Eastern Bloc production, likely from a facility in the Soviet Union or one of the satellite states like East Germany or Czechoslovakia. The ROM chip appeared to be a standard format, a 24-pin package that could interface with the Atari's cartridge port, but the fact that it was an EPROM rather than a mask ROM was immediately suspicious. Retail cartridges used mask ROMs, chips with the game code permanently burned in during manufacture. EPROMs were erasable and reprogrammable, used exclusively for prototypes, development work, or unauthorized copies. The other 2 chips were harder to identify without more detailed analysis. One of them might be a custom logic chip, possibly designed for data encoding or compression. The other had characteristics that suggested it might be some form of memory controller or decoder circuit, though Carl couldn't be sure without hooking it up to test equipment and running comprehensive diagnostics. Maxford asked if this could simply be a bootleg cartridge, and Carl shook his head slowly. Bootleg manufacturers didn't use Soviet chips in 1986, not when cheaper components were readily available from suppliers in Taiwan, Hong Kong, or South Korea. They certainly didn't use custom logic circuits and memory controllers for something as simple as copying a video game. The level of engineering evident in this cartridge was far beyond what any pirate operation would invest in, and the presence of Soviet-manufactured components raised questions that Carl found deeply concerning, given the current geopolitical climate and the nature of their work. Carl made Maxford write down every detail about the garage sale: the woman's name, the address, the approximate date, everything he could recall. Then he told Maxford something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Given their security clearances and the nature of the work they did, this needed to be reported to the FBI immediately. This wasn't something they could simply ignore or dismiss as curiosity. The combination of Soviet components, custom circuitry, and the sophisticated engineering suggested this cartridge might be something far more serious than a bootleg game. That evening, Maxford made the call. He dialed the FBI field office in Washington, and after being transferred twice, reached the duty agent. He explained who he was, where he worked, mentioned his security clearance, and described what he'd found. The agent listened, asked clarifying questions, and told Maxford someone would call him back. The following afternoon, Maxford received a call from Special Agent Mark Rivera. Rivera asked if Maxford could bring the cartridge to the FBI's Washington field office the next morning. Maxford agreed, and on Friday morning, April 11th, he made the drive with the disassembled cartridge carefully packed in a box. Rivera met him there, along with another agent who introduced himself as Dennis Cole. Maxford laid out the cartridge components and walked them through his discovery. He explained the garage sale, his son's attempt to play the game, his decision to open it, what he'd found inside. He showed them his sketches, pointed out the markings, described Carl Hutchison's analysis. Rivera and Cole listened, took notes, asked questions about the garage sale and the woman who'd sold him the cartridge. They photographed the circuit board, documented the chip markings, and had Maxford sign a statement. The meeting lasted about 90 minutes. Rivera thanked Maxford for bringing this to their attention, said they'd keep the cartridge for analysis, and that someone might follow up with additional questions. He asked Maxford to keep this confidential. As Maxford was leaving, Rivera made a comment that stuck with him. The agent said they received tips about unusual electronics fairly regularly, and most turned out to be nothing. However, given Maxford's background and Carl Hutchison's analysis, they'd certainly look into it. Maxford left with the distinct impression the FBI was being polite, but wasn't particularly convinced this was anything significant. Weeks passed, then months, with no word from the FBI. Maxford occasionally wondered what had happened, but his security clearance and professional obligations prevented casual inquiries. He'd been asked to keep the matter confidential, so he returned to his normal routine. What Maxford didn't know was that the cartridge had been logged into evidence and placed in storage. Rivera had filed a report, but the Bureau was stretched thin in 1986. The Cold War was still a reality, and counterintelligence operations consumed significant resources. The year 1985 had been dubbed the Year of the Spy due to numerous espionage cases, including the Walker spy ring, one of the most damaging intelligence breaches in American history. In that context, a video game cartridge with unusual components seemed low priority. The cartridge remained in the evidence locker for nearly a year, untouched, while more pressing investigations demanded attention. Then, in March 1987, something changed. The FBI's Technical Services Division in Quantico received a directive to systematically evaluate electronics seized in various cases for intelligence purposes. This was part of a broader push to improve the Bureau's technical capabilities. The directive came from FBI Director William Webster himself. The cartridge was included in a batch sent to Quantico. It arrived at the Technical Services Lab on March 24, 1987, accompanied by Rivera's case file. The item had been in storage for 11 months. The technician assigned was Peter Voss, 28, with background in computer science and digital electronics. When the cartridge arrived, Voss started with visual inspection. Voss identified the ROM chip as an EPROM in a standard 24-pin package, which immediately indicated this wasn't retail. The other chips were mysterious. Voss photographed the markings and sent images to the CIA. The agency would eventually confirm that the chips was Soviet-made. likely from a facility near Moscow manufacturing components for military and intelligence applications. Voss carefully desoldered the ROM chip and connected it to an EEPROM reader to extract the binary data. When the data appeared on his screen in hexadecimal format, he frowned. The data wasn't random noise. It had structure, clear patterns, but it didn't match Atari game code. The data appeared encrypted or encoded, deliberately obfuscated. Voss spent 2 weeks analyzing the ROM data, trying various approaches. He ran statistical analysis, examined for compression artifacts. The data was densely packed, using all 8 kilobytes, with characteristics suggesting both compression and encryption. In mid-April 1987, Voss contacted the National Security Agency's cryptanalysis group at Fort Meade. The NSA had resources far beyond what the FBI possessed for breaking codes. He sent them complete ROM data with high-resolution photographs of the circuit board. The NSA assigned a team to the problem. For 7 months, they worked on the data, running it through analysis tools, comparing against known Soviet encryption schemes. The Soviet chips presented their own challenge. Without documentation, the NSA had to reverse engineer their function by studying the circuit board layout. By November 1987, the NSA team had made a breakthrough. One Soviet chip was a custom decoder circuit designed to work with specific data structures in the ROM. The chip implemented a proprietary algorithm transforming encoded data into original format, but only when powered and interfaced correctly. The other chip was a memory controller managing data flow. The NSA developed a software emulation, recreating what the chip did in code. On November 18, 1987, 19 months after Maxford had walked into the FBI field office, they successfully decoded the ROM data. What they found sent immediate alerts through the intelligence community. The ROM contained technical specifications for American warfare systems, specifically operational parameters of radar warning receivers and electronic countermeasure equipment used in F-15 and F-16 fighter aircraft. The information included frequency ranges, signal processing algorithms, response times, and countermeasure effectiveness data. The data was classified secret and top secret. The data had been compressed, then encoded using the custom decoder chip scheme, then stored to masquerade as a malfunctioning video game cartridge. The entire package was elegant in simplicity and devastating in implications. The NSA immediately contacted the FBI's counterintelligence division. Within hours, the case was upgraded to highest priority. The implications were staggering. Someone had successfully smuggled classified information out of a secure facility, possibly one of dozens of defense contractor sites or military installations in the Washington area. They'd hidden it inside a consumer video game cartridge that could pass through security checkpoints without raising any suspicion whatsoever. The cartridge had somehow entered the consumer marketplace, perhaps intentionally, perhaps by mistake. The FBI launched a full investigation in December 1987. Teams of agents fanned out across Virginia and Maryland, trying to reconstruct the cartridge's path from its point of origin to the Vasquez garage sale nearly 2 years earlier. The first step was to recontact Evan Maxford. On December 8, 1987, agents Rivera and Cole appeared at Maxford's door. Maxford was surprised to see them, having assumed the matter had been quietly dropped or resolved. Rivera explained the cartridge had been analyzed and found to contain classified information, that this was now a major counterintelligence investigation, and they needed his help reconstructing the circumstances. The agents asked if Maxford still had contact information for Mrs. Vasquez. Maxford didn't, but he knew the address on Gainsborough Drive. Rivera and Cole drove there immediately. They found the house, but Mrs. Vasquez no longer lived there. The current occupants said they'd bought the house from an estate sale. Through the real estate agent, the FBI learned that Eleanor Vasquez had died in June 1987, just weeks after the NSA had begun their cryptanalysis work. Her remaining possessions had been liquidated by her daughter in Florida. The FBI contacted the daughter, who provided information about Thomas. He was 23 now, still living in Baltimore, still working as a mechanic. When Rivera and Cole tracked him down in mid-December 1987, Thomas was cooperative but bewildered. Thomas explained he'd been into Atari throughout high school, from 1978 until graduation in 1982. He'd accumulated dozens of cartridges through various means, trading with friends, buying at stores, receiving as gifts. When he'd moved to Baltimore in 1985, he'd left most of his belongings behind, including the video games, never imagining they'd become the subject of a federal investigation. When Rivera asked about Space Battle 2, Thomas paused, trying to recall details from 5 or 6 years earlier. He remembered it vaguely. He thought a friend had given it to him. Or maybe they'd swapped cartridges during lunch period at school. The agents pressed for the friend's name. Thomas struggled to remember specifics. The name that came to mind was Trey Orwell, someone in his computer science class. A kid who'd been really into programming and had talked about making his own games. But Thomas couldn't be certain that Trey was the source of that specific cartridge, and he'd lost touch with most of his high school friends after graduation. The FBI obtained Thomas's high school records through federal court order. They found Trey Orwell listed in Thomas's computer science class in spring 1981. Through records, Orwell was located in Northern Virginia, working as a software developer. When agents questioned him, in January 1988, Orwell remembered Thomas vaguely but had no recollection of ever owning or trading Space Battle 2. He'd been into programming his own games in high school and had owned an Atari 2600 briefly, but he'd sold his collection at a garage sale in 1983. The trail went nowhere. Every lead evaporated. It was impossible to determine where the cartridge came from or how it ended up in Thomas's collection. The cartridge could have passed through a dozen hands. There were no receipts, no records, no way to trace the chain backward. The FBI expanded investigation to examine how the classified information was stolen. The specifications belonged to electronic warfare systems manufactured by Raytheon and Hughes Aircraft, companies with facilities employing thousands with security clearances. The list of potential suspects with access to this data was enormous, spanning multiple programs over several years. Investigators looked for employees with connections to Soviet intelligence, people with both access and technical knowledge to create the cartridge. They cross-referenced personnel records with known espionage cases, examined travel records and financial transactions. The investigation consumed thousands of man-hours and produced volumes of reports, but no definitive suspects emerged. By March 1988, the FBI confronted an uncomfortable reality. The cartridge was a dead end, and the trail had gone cold. The classified information had almost certainly been compromised. If one cartridge existed, investigators assumed others did too. Some had likely reached Soviet intelligence, delivering their payloads before anyone knew to look. The FBI issued classified alerts to defense contractors and military installations, warning about data smuggling through consumer electronics. But the guidance was vague because investigators didn't fully understand the operation's scope. What they did know was this: someone in the American defense industry had developed an ingenious method for stealing classified information. They'd used the ubiquity of video games to create a smuggling network operating in plain sight. Somehow, a cartridge that ended up at a garage sale had exposed the operation, and only by accident, because Evan Maxford possessed the curiosity and technical knowledge to recognize something unusual. The investigation officially remained open, but by late 1988, active work had ceased. The case files were sealed, marked unsolved. Evan Maxford received a letter from the FBI in September 1988, thanking him for his cooperation. He never spoke publicly about what he'd found. The Atari 2600 Junior was discontinued in 1992. The video game industry had moved on to 16-bit consoles, CD-ROM technology, three-dimensional graphics. As the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the significance of the cartridge faded into history, becoming another footnote in the long catalogue of espionage operations.